Old Fords are weird. And today we're going to talk about the weird. And there's plenty of it to talk about. Matter of fact, there's more to talk about than I'm going to talk about today. Let's get to it.
For 45 years, the Miller family and the dedicated staff at Autocrafters have been here helping you to restore your dream Ford. Thank you for your support. Here's to another 45 years of delivering parts for your Falcon, Fairlane, F-100, Galaxy, Maverick, and Pinto.
All right, we're talking about things that drive Ford guys crazy as far as changes that Ford made. Please understand that if I don't mention it, anything that applies to Ford also applies to our friends over in the Mercury camp. They're part of our little family. They're just classier. All right, so what I'm going to talk about first is body bolts and J-nuts. These are the things that they use to put the bodies together on your classic Ford. And Ford did something very irritating, and I know why they did it, but it's still irritating because I can't find anything on the market right now that is a good way to go in and redo those original bolts. Because prior to 1965, Ford used a fine thread bolt and J-nut assembly to put the classic cars together. And nobody is making that stuff as far as I can find in the market right now. After 1965, they went to a plunge setup where basically it's a flat piece of sheet steel and they plunged it, and then they took a tap and tapped that, and the bolts and all are coarse, and they use a different end cap on them. And I think all of this was done to keep from having so much waste whenever you're putting those cars together, because a fine thread is much harder to get started a lot of times than a coarse thread bolt. So they went to the coarse thread, I think, in a twofold thing. One was to go in and actually make the thing easier to install, but two, it was probably a lot cheaper to build the plunge cut or the plunge set J-bolt rather than the one that had to be assembled like the ones I've been showing you here next to me. So there you go. One of the main things that kind of ticks me off. I can get bolts for anything after 1964. Prior to that, not much out there in the market that you can do as a replacement. And it's a little hard to go in on those cars and actually just go to a coarse thread bolt on them, because some of the captive nuts on the chassis and bodies are actually fine thread as well. Everything body-wise was fine thread. So it was a little hard to go in and just say, right, I'm going to replace everything and go with this 1965 and later coarse thread bolt. Ford didn't want you to do that. With balance, Ford decided to change the balance on their engines. Prior to 1981, the Ford M balance was 28, or balance, I don't know, whichever way you want to call it. After 1981, they went to a 50-ounce M balance. Why? I don't know. I think it was probably a cost-saving measure, because it's much cheaper to go in and balance an engine to a 50-ounce than it is to balance it to a 28. I think it's something to do with the machining processes and all that. At least that's what I read on a forum, and gosh knows, we all know that forums are the most accurate place to get information ever. All right, next up is Bellhousings. Now this is where it can get a little sticky as well, because Ford in 1965, 1966 went from a 5-bolt bell housing and a narrow transmission case to a 6-bolt bell housing and a wide mount transmission case. The photographs I'm showing you right here are the two different bell housings. You'll note the narrow mounting for case and the wide mounting for case. I have actually seen some transmissions that have both sets of bolt holes in them. They have the wide mounting with a narrow mounting position also on the flanges. And I think that was because Ford was probably kind of bleeding out the narrows and moving to the wides, and they didn't want to have to hassle around with trying to change out and find that narrow case. They wanted to just be able to slap that sucker in there and make it roll. So that's a problem, but there's even more to it than that, because besides the 6-bolt bell housing, Ford also had a 164 tooth flywheel and a 157 tooth flywheel, and that causes some problems as well inside the bell housing itself. Also, Ford had two different starters for their manual shift and automatics. The automatics got a different starter than the manual shift. The manual shift has a shorter snout because the ring gear for the starter is in a different spot on the manual bell or manual flywheel, than it is on the automatic flex plate. So Ford didn't decide to go in for some reason and standardize all that. They just kind of mixed and matched, and it's a hassle. Let's just put it that way. It's a real hassle. What you saw with us on Autorestomod has very little to do with any of that. It actually is the mid plate on that. None of those really changed. You got different mid plates for different flywheels, but you didn't get a different, setup on the other stuff. It's just crazy what they did. Okay, this is going to get really complicated for a second. We're going to be talking about running suspension changes that Ford did on everything from, I don't know, let's just talk early cars on the Fairlane Falcon side. Okay, so we're going to talk about steering changes on Falcon. Now in 1964 to 65, Ford changed the tie rod and drag link setup and as well the idler arm setup on their steering systems for the Falcon. Completely different in 65 from 64. Ford also made that kind of a change in the 1967 Fairlane. The 66 Fairlane had a different tie rod setup than the 67, but you can just change out the tie rods. It doesn't affect anything to go to a 67 tie rod on a 66 Fairlane. But Ford also changed the Fairlane suspension. You had the Fairlane from 62 to 65, had a completely different suspension setup than the 1966 on up. But Ford also changed the strut rod assembly in 1968 on the Mustang, Falcon, Fairlane, Montego, Comet. I think that's everybody in the pool, not completely sure, but they changed that strut rod setup in 1968. Also, Ford changed the camber adjustment. The 1965 and 6 Mustang had a different camber setup than the 1967 on up. They moved away from the shims that you put in the upper control arm to a actual camber adjustment down on the lower control arm. Now that change was made in 1966 on the Fairlane. The 65 Fairlane still used the shim adjustment. Confused yet? If you're looking at getting into a Ford, this probably isn't the very first video you should watch for making a decision on buying a classic Ford, because it's kind of an indictment of all the changes that Ford made. But we're not done with suspension stuff yet. Oh no. So in 1967, the Mustang went from the suspension style that it had prior to that, which was based on the 1964-65, and they moved the suspension up to the 1966-67 on up Fairlane style. So you have the same suspension in 1967 on the Mustang that you have on the Fairlane. Then that change I talked about before with the strut rods that changed in 1968. And please don't get me started on spindles. That's another cataclysmic baddie all on its own. Now, wheels. Our friends at Ford even jacked around with that back in the 1960s. Prior to 1968, Ford ran a 2 3/8 inch opening on the wheels, which is a small opening. After 1968, they went to a 2 3/4 inch opening, and that was because they went to a single piston caliper disc brake spindle that was specific for disc brakes. Prior to that, they were running Kelsey Hayes style 4-piston calipers when they applied disc brakes to their high-performance cars. Now, in 1970, Ford changed the spindles. I know I said I wasn't going to get into spindles, but it kind of applies to the brakes, so just bear with me for a second, if you will. 1970, they changed it because they were running into problems, I think, with the 69 Boss 302 and the big 15-inch F6015 tires that they were running on those cars. They started breaking spindles. So Ford decided to go to a larger spindle hub assembly with a larger taper on the tie rod end out at the spindle. Now that tie rod end was no different anywhere else. It was just the actual taper that goes up inside of the spindle. Why? Like I said, I think it had something to do with the 69 Boss 302s and the bigger tires that they were running in the stickier tires that were coming out and being made available to the cars at that point. Bonus round, something that didn't change. I know, Ford guys, you're going to be really stunned by this. But Ford actually did not change one thing on their classic cars, and that was the voltage required to run the gauges. At least up through 86 as far as I can find. The voltage regulator never changed. They ran a 6-volt-ish gauge package from like the 1950s, maybe even into the 40s and 30s, all the way up to 1986. So there you go, folks. Things don't always change on a Ford, just most of the time. Well, that's all we have time for this week, folks. Do me a favor, be kind to each other, love on each other, please treat each other nice. You guys have a great week, and we'll see you on down the road. There's more. I mean, I could probably do an hour-long video. Those are the big ones. Well, at least for me. The things that I've always run into as problems on my classic Fords. There's other things, like I said, the spindles. I think we've done a video on spindles and the differences between Granada spindles. Believe it or not, the Maverick spindle and the Mustang spindle were completely different. They have a different part number. It's the same basic drum brake spindle. Even the Maverick disc brake spindle has a different part number. Granada has a different part number for their disc brakes. It'll work on a classic Mustang, but the taper, or not the taper, but the angle of the tie rod arms is a little different, and those kind of things change. I'm talking about spindles, and I said I wouldn't. I said I wouldn't do it, but here I am blathering on about spindles.